I used to believe that love could conquer anything, that no matter how far someone strayed, family would always find its way back to each other. I believed this so deeply that I spent 67 years of my life building a fortune, not for myself, but for the one person I thought would treasure it most, my daughter, Sarah. But love, I've learned, can be the most dangerous weapon when placed in the wrong hands. And sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones who know exactly where to aim it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months ago, I was Phyllis Green, a proud mother and successful businesswoman worth $8.2 million. Today, I'm still Phyllis Green, still worth $8.2 million. But my daughter, she's discovered that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt, and some trust funds, once lost, disappear forever. This is the story of how 3 days without food taught me more about my daughter's character than 35 years of motherhood ever did. It's about the moment I realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to stop giving, and it's about the choice I made that changed both of our lives forever. My name is Phyllis Green, and if you saw me walking down the street, you'd probably think I was just another 70-year-old woman with silver hair and reading glasses, someone's grandmother heading to the grocery store or the library. You wouldn't guess that I built Green & Associates from nothing, turning a small accounting firm into one of the most respected financial consulting companies in the state. You wouldn't know that I've spent the last 4 decades making millionaires out of middle-class families, or that I've been featured on the cover of Business Weekly 3 times. But most importantly, you wouldn't see the weight I carry in my chest every single day. The weight of loving someone who stopped loving me back a long time ago, even though I was too blind to see it. I'm sitting in my study right now. The same mahogany-paneled room where I've made some of the most important decisions of my life. The walls are lined with awards, photographs from charity galas, and framed articles about my business success. But none of those accolades matter anymore. What matters is the empty chair across from my desk, the one where my daughter Sarah used to sit when she'd visit, back when her visits weren't just about money. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent my entire career teaching people how to build wealth, how to secure their children's futures, how to create legacy that would last generations. I preached the importance of financial planning, of teaching your children the value of money and hard work. Yet somehow, I failed to see that I was creating the very monster that would eventually turn against me. Sarah was born when I was 35, after years of trying to conceive. My husband Robert and I had almost given up hope when the doctor confirmed what we barely dared to believe. She was our miracle baby, our golden child, the answer to every prayer we'd whispered in the dark. Robert used to joke that we'd won the lottery when Sarah was born, with her bright blue eyes and infectious laugh. He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. When Sarah was 3 years old, Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months. He fought for 2 years, every single day, because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving us alone. I watched the strongest man I'd ever known waste away to nothing, and through it all, he made me promise that I would take care of our little girl, that I would give her everything we'd dreamed of giving her together. I kept that promise, perhaps too well. After Robert died, I threw myself into building the business with a ferocity that surprised even me. Every client I gained, every deal I closed, every dollar I earned was for Sarah. I told myself I was securing her future, making sure she'd never want for anything. I worked 18-hour days, missed school plays and soccer games, hired nannies, and drivers and tutors to fill the gaps where I should have been. But I always made sure Sarah had the best of everything. The best schools, where she glided through without ever really trying. The best clothes, which she discarded as quickly as she acquired them. The best opportunities, which she took for granted, like oxygen in the air. I justified every absence, every missed moment, by pointing to the bank account that grew larger every year. I was building her a castle, I told myself. What did it matter if I wasn't there to see her play in it? Sarah was brilliant. There's no denying that. She graduated valedictorian from Westfield Academy, got accepted to Harvard with a full academic scholarship she didn't even need. She studied international business, which made my heart swell with pride. I thought she was following in my footsteps, that we'd work together someday, that Green and Associates would become Green and Green. I should have paid more attention to the way she talked about her classmates, always with a subtle disdain for those she considered beneath her station. I should have noticed how she never seemed to form genuine friendships, how people were either useful to her or invisible. I should have been concerned when she came home for holidays and spent more time on her phone than talking to me, when our conversations became increasingly centered around what she needed rather than how she was doing. But I was so proud of her success, so grateful that my sacrifice had paid off, that I ignored the warning signs. When she graduated magna cum laude and landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm in Manhattan, I thought we'd done it. I thought I'd fulfilled my promise to Robert. The trust fund was my final gift to her, the capstone of everything I'd worked for. $8.2 million, carefully invested and managed, growing steadily year after year. I'd set it up, when she turned 18, with specific terms that I thought would encourage responsibility. She could access the full amount when she turned 35, or earlier if she married someone I approved of and showed she was ready to handle such wealth responsibly. At the time, I thought these were reasonable conditions. I'd seen too many. Wealthy families destroyed by children who inherited too much too young. I wanted Sarah to build her own life first, to understand the value of work and commitment before she gained access to the kind of money that could corrupt someone without a strong moral foundation. Now I realize that by the time I created that trust fund, it was already too late. The corruption had already taken root. Sarah accepted the terms without argument when I explained them to her on her 18th birthday. She even thanked me, told me she understood my reasoning and respected my decision. But looking back now, I can see something else in her eyes that night. A coldness, a calculation that I mistook for maturity. For the next several years, our relationship followed a predictable pattern. Sarah would call every few weeks, always cheerful, always interested in my health and my business. She'd visit for holidays and special occasions, bringing expensive gifts and sharing stories about her life in the city. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She dated occasionally, but never seriously, and whenever I asked about marriage, she'd laugh and say she was too focused on her career to think about settling down. I believed her. I believed everything she told me because I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that I'd raised a daughter who was independent and strong, who valued her own achievements over inherited wealth. I wanted to believe that the long hours and missed moments had been worth it, that I'd successfully created the kind of person Robert would have been proud of. The first crack in this perfect facade appeared about 6 months ago, when Sarah called to tell me about Marcus. Marcus Rodriguez, she said, was everything she'd been looking for in a partner. He was intelligent, ambitious, charming, and shared her vision for the future. He worked in private equity, which impressed me. Anyone who could succeed in that cutthroat industry had to have both talent and drive. Sarah's voice had a quality I'd never heard before when she talked about him, a warmth that made me think she'd finally found someone who could make her happy. When she asked if she could bring him to meet me, I was thrilled. I immediately began planning the visit, imagining how wonderful it would be to see Sarah truly in love, to welcome a new member into our small family. I had the house cleaned from top to bottom, hired a chef to prepare a special dinner, and even bought new china for the occasion. But Marcus never came. The first visit was canceled because of a work emergency. The second because Marcus had come down with food poisoning. The third because there was a family crisis that required his immediate attention. Each time, Sarah, was apologetic but understanding, explaining that Marcus's career demanded flexibility and that she was learning to adapt to the unpredictable nature of his schedule. I told myself that this was normal, that successful people often had to juggle competing priorities. But something nagged at me about the way Sarah's explanations became more elaborate each time, the way she seemed to anticipate my questions before I asked them. Then, about 3 months ago, Sarah's communication pattern changed. Instead of calling every few weeks, she started calling every few days. Instead of casual conversations about work and weather, every call became focused on the trust fund. She wanted to know about the performance of the investments, the current value of the account, the specific language of the trust documents. She explained that she and Marcus were thinking about getting married, that they wanted to start planning their future together. She asked detailed questions about the approval process, what exactly I would need to know about Marcus before I could give my consent to early distribution of the funds. I was delighted. Finally, my daughter was ready to settle down with someone she loved, someone who could give her the partnership and stability I'd always wanted for her. I began preparing for the formal meeting with Marcus, the conversation where I'd evaluate whether he was worthy of my daughter and my trust. But then the questions became more pointed. Sarah wanted to know if there were any ways around the marriage requirement, any loopholes that might allow her to access the funds sooner. She asked about my health, about my estate planning, about what would happen to the trust if something happened to me. I tried to address her concerns patiently, explaining that the trust was ironclad by design, that the only ways to access the principal before 35 were marriage with my approval or a genuine emergency that I deemed worthy of exception. I assured her that the trust would continue to exist even if I died, that I'd set up a board of trustees to ensure the terms were honored. Sarah seemed to accept these explanations, but I noticed that our conversations became shorter after that, more businesslike. When I tried to steer the discussion toward her relationship with Marcus, toward their wedding plans or when I might finally meet him, she became vague and evasive. I started to worry that maybe Marcus wasn't as serious about marriage as Sarah had indicated. I began to suspect that perhaps he was pressuring her to access the trust fund before making a real commitment. I'd seen this pattern before with clients, ambitious young men who saw wealthy women as opportunities rather than partners. So I decided to take action. I called Sarah and told her that I wanted to meet Marcus before we discussed the trust fund any further. I explained that this wasn't just about the money. I wanted to get to know the man who had captured my daughter's heart, to welcome him into our family properly. Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. She told me that Marcus was a very private person, that he didn't feel comfortable with formal evaluations or interviews. She said that my insistence on meeting him felt controlling and old-fashioned, that she was a grown woman who didn't need her mother's approval to make life decisions. This stung more than I expected. I'd thought I was being reasonable, even generous, by offering to release the trust funds early if she found the right partner. But Sarah made me feel like I was being manipulative, like I was using the money to control her life. I backed down. I told her that, of course, she was right, that I trusted her judgment completely. I said that if she was happy with Marcus, then I was happy for her. All I wanted was a chance to meet him, not to judge him, but to celebrate with them. Sarah apologized for her harsh tone, explaining that she'd been under a lot of stress at work and that Marcus was dealing with some family issues that made him reluctant to socialize. She promised that we'd all have dinner together soon as things calmed down in their respective careers. That was 2 months ago. Since then, every attempt to schedule a meeting has been deflected or delayed. Sarah's calls became less frequent again, and when we did talk, she seemed distracted and impatient. She stopped asking about the trust fund directly, but I could sense that it was still on her mind, lurking beneath every conversation like a shark in shallow water. I tried to tell myself that this was normal, that relationships go through phases, that Sarah was just busy building her life with Marcus. But deep down, I started to feel like I was losing her, like the daughter I'd devoted my life to was slipping. away from me one conversation at a time. The house felt different too. Sarah had always kept a room here, a space that was entirely hers even when she wasn't visiting. I'd maintained it exactly as she'd left it after college, with her awards, and photos and favorite books arranged just the way she liked them. But lately, when I walked past that room, it felt like a museum exhibit rather than a living space. It felt like a shrine to someone who no longer existed. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd made the right choices. Had I been too controlling with the trust fund? Had I inadvertently pushed Sarah away by trying to protect her? Had I failed as a mother by prioritizing financial security over emotional connection? These doubts consumed me. I found myself second-guessing every decision I'd made over the past 35 years, wondering if Robert would have handled things differently, if he would have seen something I'd missed. I started drafting emails to Sarah that I never sent, apologies for mistakes I wasn't even sure I'd made. But then, last week, everything changed. Sarah called on a Tuesday evening, just as I was finishing dinner. Her voice had a brightness to it that I hadn't heard in months, an energy that immediately lifted my spirits. She said she had wonderful news. She and Marcus had made a decision. They were ready to take the next step in their relationship, and they wanted to include me in their plans. She asked if she could come visit that weekend, if we could spend some quality time together and have the important conversations we'd been putting off. I was overjoyed. Finally, I thought, we were going to bridge the gap that had been growing between us. Finally, I was going to meet the man my daughter loved and give them my blessing to build their future together. I spent the entire week preparing for her visit. I had the guest room cleaned and stocked with fresh flowers. I planned meals around all of Sarah's favorite foods from childhood. I even went shopping for a special gift for Marcus, a vintage bottle of scotch that I thought would make a good first impression. By Friday afternoon, I was practically vibrating with anticipation. I kept checking my phone for updates on Sarah's travel plans, eager to know when she'd arrive so I could have everything. Perfect! She texted me at 6 p.m. to say she was on her way, that she'd be there by 8. I spent those 2 hours putting the finishing touches on everything, changing clothes 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that Sarah had always said brought out my eyes. When the doorbell rang at 8:15, I practically ran to answer it. I threw open the door with the biggest smile I'd worn in months, ready to embrace my daughter and welcome her home. But the moment I saw Sarah's face, I knew something was wrong. She looked beautiful as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her designer clothes immaculate. But her eyes were cold, calculating, distant. She looked at me the way a stranger might look at a house they were thinking about buying, assessing, and evaluating rather than greeting with love. She hugged me briefly, perfunctorily, then stepped back and surveyed the foyer with those calculating eyes. "Hello, Mother," she said. And something about the way she said it made my blood run cold. "We need to talk." That's when I knew that everything I'd believed about my daughter, everything I'd built my life around, was about to crumble. That's when I realized that the woman standing in my doorway wasn't the child I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize at all. And that was just the beginning. The silence that followed Sarah's greeting stretched between us like a chasm. I stood there in my own doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder. In my own home, watching my daughter examine the space as if she were calculating its worth down to the last penny. The warmth I'd prepared, the joy I'd anticipated, evaporated in the face of her clinical assessment. "Of course, sweetheart," I managed, stepping aside to let her enter. Come in. I've prepared your favorite dinner and I have that bottle of wine you brought me last Christmas. I thought we could open it tonight." Sarah walked past me without acknowledgement, her heels clicking against the marble floor, with a rhythm that sounded almost aggressive. She moved through the foyer and into the living room with the confidence of someone who owned the place, which I suppose, in her mind, she eventually would. "Where's Marcus?" I asked, following her. "I thought he might be coming with you this time." She turned to face me then, and the look in her eyes made me take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger exactly, or even annoyance. It was something far more unsettling, a complete absence of warmth, as if she were looking at a piece of furniture rather than the woman who had given birth to her. "Marcus isn't coming," she said simply. "This conversation is between you and me." The way she emphasized conversation made my stomach tighten. This wasn't the loving reunion I'd envisioned. This was something else entirely, something that felt more like a business meeting than a family gathering. "Well, that's fine," I said, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. "We haven't had proper mother-daughter time in ages. I've missed you so much, Sarah. Come, sit down. Tell me everything that's been happening in your life." But Sarah didn't move toward the comfortable seating area I'd arranged. Instead, she remained standing in the center of the room, her posture rigid and formal. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest like armor. "I'm not here for small talk, Mother. I'm here because we have business to discuss, and I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say." The formality of her tone sent ice through my veins. This was my daughter, my only child, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers and celebrated with at every milestone. Yet she was speaking to me like I was a client in her office, someone to be managed rather than loved. "Business," I repeated, sinking onto the edge of the sofa. "Sarah, what's this about? You're scaring me." She set her bag down on the coffee table and finally took a seat, but she chose the chair farthest from me, the one that put the entire length of the coffee table between us. Even in my own living room, she was creating distance, establishing boundaries that felt more like battle lines. "The trust fund," she said without preamble. "I need access to it now. Not when I turn 35, not when I get married with your approval. Now." The bluntness of her statement hit me like a physical blow. No explanation, no context, no attempt to soften the demand with affection or even basic courtesy. Just a direct order, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Sarah, we've discussed this," I said carefully. "The terms were set. Up for good reasons. You're only 32, and you've never shown any interest in taking on that level of financial responsibility before. The trust is designed to—" "I don't care what it's designed to do," she interrupted, her voice cutting through my explanation like a blade. "I care about what I need right now. Marcus and I have opportunities that require immediate capital investment. We can't wait 3 more years." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my growing unease. "If it's a legitimate business venture, perhaps we could discuss a loan against the trust. There are ways to— no loans, no partial payments, no compromises." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me shrink back against the sofa cushions. "I want the entire principal transferred to my personal accounts within the next 30 days. The sheer audacity of her demand left me momentarily speechless. $8.2 million, transferred just because she'd decided she wanted it. No explanation of need, no discussion of consequences, no recognition of the years of careful planning and investment that had built that fund. "Sarah, that's not how trust funds work," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There are legal requirements, fiduciary responsibilities. The trustees have obligations to—" "You control those trustees," she said flatly. "Everyone on that board is either your employee or someone who owes their career to your recommendations. Don't pretend you don't have the power to make this happen." She was right, of course. I'd chosen the trustees carefully, selecting people I trusted to honor my intentions for Sarah's future. But the fact that she'd clearly researched the structure of the trust, identified the key players, and developed a strategy to circumvent the protections I'd put in place that revealed a level of calculation that chilled me to the bone. Even if I could influence the trustees, I said slowly, I wouldn't. Those protections exist for your benefit, Sarah. They're meant to ensure that you're ready to handle that kind of wealth responsibly. The laugh that escaped her lips was harsh and bitter, nothing like the joyful sound I remembered from her childhood. Responsibly? Mother, I'm 32 years old. I have an MBA from Harvard and 5 years of experience in high-level consulting. What exactly do you think I'm going to do with the money? Blow it all on drugs and gambling? Of course not, I said quickly. But large sums of money can be overwhelming even for intelligent people. I've seen what happens when... You've seen what happens to other people's children, Sarah interrupted. People who weren't raised with wealth, who didn't grow up understanding how money works. I'm not some trust fund baby who's never had to work for anything. I've built my own career, made my own money. With my support, I pointed out gently. The best schools, the connections I provided, the financial security that allowed you to take unpaid internships and build your resume without worrying about student loans or living expenses. Sarah's expression hardened further, if that was possible. So what? That's what parents are supposed to do. That's what you chose to do. You don't get to hold that over my head for the rest of my life. The casual dismissal of decades of sacrifice hit me harder than any slap could have. All those 18-hour days, all those missed school plays and soccer games, all those years of building something meaningful so that she could have every advantage, reduced to an obligation, something I was supposed to do. I'm not holding anything over your head, I said, struggling to keep the hurt out of my voice. I'm trying to protect you. The terms of the trust were carefully considered. They're meant to ensure that you're in a stable place in your life before you take on the responsibility of managing that kind of wealth. Stable? Sarah's voice rose for the first time since she'd arrived. I have a 6-figure salary, a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, and a relationship with a man who understands my ambitions. How much more stable do I need to be? Then bring Marcus to meet me, I said, seizing on the opening. If you're so serious about this relationship, if he's such an important part of your future, why haven't I been able to meet him? It's been months since you first mentioned him, and every time we plan to get together, something comes up. Sarah's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or guilt. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Marcus doesn't perform for parents, she said coolly. He's not going to jump through hoops to prove himself worthy of your daughter. He has his own money, his own success. He doesn't need your approval. But I do, I said softly. I need to know the man my daughter is planning to marry. I need to see that he loves you for who you are, not what you're worth. Surely that's not unreasonable. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. She began pacing the length of the room, her movements sharp and agitated. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she said, her voice tight with frustration. You use words like reasonable and protection, but what you really mean is control. You want to control who I marry, when I access my own money, how I live my life. That money isn't yours yet, I said quietly. It's held in trust for your benefit, with conditions that were established for good reasons. Sarah whirled to face me, her eyes blazing with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere deep and toxic within her. Good reasons, or your reasons? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're using that trust fund to keep me dependent on you, to make sure I never fully escape your influence. The accusation was so unfair, so completely contrary to everything I'd tried to do as a mother, that it left me gasping. Every decision I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured had been for her benefit. The trust fund wasn't a leash. It was a gift, carefully structured to provide her with security and opportunity. That's not true, I whispered. Everything I've done has been for you, to give you the best possible future. The future you chose, Sarah shot back. The future you designed. What if I want something different? What if Marcus and I have plans that don't fit into your careful little timeline? Then tell me about them, I pleaded. Help me understand. If there's something you need, some opportunity that requires immediate access to the funds. I don't owe you explanations, Sarah said, cutting me off with brutal finality. I don't owe you justifications for my choices or detailed business plans for my future. I'm 32 years old, and I'm done asking permission to live my life. She moved to the window and stood with her back to me, staring out at the carefully manicured gardens that I'd spent years perfecting. In the growing dusk, her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, cold, hard, unrecognizable. Sarah, I said softly, rising from the sofa to approach her. Please, let's not fight like this. You're my daughter, my only child. I love you more than my own life. If I've done something to hurt you, if I've made you feel controlled or constrained, that was never my intention. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my approach or my words. She simply stood there, rigid and unresponsive, as if I were speaking to a statue. All I want is what's best for you, I continued, stopping a few feet behind her. The trust, fund, the conditions, everything, it's all meant to protect you, to make sure you have the security and freedom to build the life you want. Finally, she turned, and the expression on her face made me take an involuntary step backward. It was contempt, pure and undiluted, the look someone might give to an insect they were about to crush. What's best for me, she said slowly, is access to my inheritance. What's best for me is the freedom to make my own choices without having to justify them to someone who thinks she knows better than I do about my own life. But the conditions are your way of maintaining control, Sarah said, her voice rising again. You created a system where I have to come to you, hat in hand, begging for permission to access money that should rightfully be mine. You made yourself the gatekeeper to my own future. The venom in her voice was like nothing I'd ever heard from her before. This wasn't the petulant anger of a child, or the reasonable frustration of an adult facing bureaucratic obstacles. This was something deeper and more disturbing, a fundamental rejection of our relationship, of the love and sacrifice that had defined my entire adult life. Sarah, I'm done with this conversation, she said abruptly, moving away from the window and back toward the center of the room. I've told you what I need. I've explained that I want access to the trust fund immediately. Now you need to decide whether you're going to help me or continue to stand in my way. The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a sword. Choose her demands or lose her entirely. Submit to her will or be cut out of her life. There was no room for discussion, no possibility of compromise, no recognition that I might have legitimate concerns or valid reasons for maintaining the trust structure. It's not that simple, I said desperately. There are legal procedures, fiduciary obligations. Even if I wanted to release the funds immediately, there are steps that have to be followed. Then start following them, Sarah said coldly. Call your lawyers tomorrow. Initiate whatever procedures are necessary. I want this resolved within 30 days. And if I don't? Sarah picked up her handbag and slung it over her shoulder, her movements sharp and decisive. Then you'll discover just how little your daughter needs you in her life. The threat was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. She knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to hurt me most effectively. The fact that she was willing to weaponize our relationship, to use my love for her as a tool of manipulation, revealed something about her character that I'd never seen before. You don't mean that, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. She did mean it. She meant every cold, calculated syllable. Try me, Sarah said simply. She moved toward the foyer, her heels clicking against the eye, floor with the same aggressive rhythm I'd noticed when she arrived. I followed her, my mind racing, trying to find some way to salvage the situation, to reach the daughter I'd raised and loved. "Stay for dinner," I said desperately. "Please. We don't have to talk about the trust fund. We can just be together, like we used to be. I made your favorite—" "I'm not hungry," Sarah said without turning around. She paused at the front door, her hand on the handle, and looked back at me over her shoulder. 30 days, Mother. That's all the time you have to decide what matters more to you, controlling my life or keeping me in it." "Sarah, wait." But she was already gone, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the suddenly empty house. I stood there in the foyer, staring at the closed door, trying to process what had just happened. This was not the daughter I'd raised. This was not the child I'd sacrificed everything for, worked myself to exhaustion for, built an empire for. This was someone else, someone cold and calculating and cruel, someone who saw our relationship as nothing more than a transaction. I walked slowly back to the living room, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. The dinner I'd prepared was growing cold in the kitchen. The bottle of wine I'd planned to open sat unopened on the counter. The flowers I'd arranged were already beginning to wilt in their vases. I sank onto the sofa and stared at the chair where Sarah had sat, trying to reconcile the woman who'd just left with the child I remembered. When had she changed? When had love become leverage? When had family become nothing more than a means to an end? The trust fund had been my gift to her future, my way of ensuring that she'd always be secure, always be protected. But somehow, it had become a weapon she was willing to use against me, a tool of manipulation and control. I thought about the conditions I'd established, the protections I'd put in place. Were they really about her welfare? Or were they, as she'd accused, about maintaining my influence over her life? Had I created a system that kept her dependent on me, that forced her to seek my approval even as an adult? The questions circled, in my mind like vultures, picking at my confidence, my certainty, my understanding of everything I'd tried to do as a mother. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been controlling, manipulative, unwilling to let her grow up and make her own choices. But even if that were true, even if my motives had been flawed, did that justify the cruelty I'd just witnessed? Did that excuse the cold calculation, the complete absence of love or gratitude or even basic human decency? I sat there until well past midnight, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to decide what I should do. Part of me wanted to call my lawyers first thing in the morning, to begin the process of releasing the trust fund just to get my daughter back. Part of me wanted to hold firm, to maintain the boundaries I'd established, to force her to respect the conditions I'd set. But there was another part of me, a small voice in the back of my mind, that whispered something far more disturbing. What if this wasn't really about the trust fund at all? What if this was about something else? Something darker and more complicated than a daughter's impatience with her inheritance? What if the woman who'd sat in my living room, who'd delivered ultimatums with surgical precision and threatened to cut me out of her life without a trace of emotion, what if that was who Sarah really was? What if everything I'd believed about her, everything I'd built my life around, had been an illusion? I pushed that thought away, telling myself I was being paranoid, letting one difficult conversation color my perception of 32 years of motherhood. Sarah was stressed, frustrated, maybe even in some kind of trouble that she couldn't tell me about. People said things they didn't mean when they were under pressure. But as I finally made my way upstairs to bed, I couldn't shake the memory of that look in her eyes, cold, calculating, completely devoid of love. That wasn't stress or frustration. That was something else entirely. That was the look of someone who'd already decided I was expendable. I should have paid more attention to that instinct. I should have trusted what I'd seen, what I'd felt, what every maternal alarm bell in my body had been screaming. Because what happened next What Sarah did to me over the following 3 days would prove that my worst fears about my daughter's character were not only justified but far too generous. The woman I'd raised, the child I'd devoted my life to, was about to show me exactly what she was capable of when she didn't get what she wanted. And the lesson she was about to teach me would change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the price of unconditional devotion. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word of our conversation, I had no idea that this was the last night I'd spend in ignorance about my daughter's true nature. I had no idea that by this time tomorrow, I'd be trapped in my own home, abandoned and helpless, discovering just how far someone will go when they've decided you're nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I thought I'd raised a daughter. What I'd actually created was something far more dangerous, a beautiful, intelligent predator who'd learned to hide her true nature behind the mask of filial love. And tomorrow, that mask was going to come off. Completely. I woke the next morning with a headache that felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull. The emotional turmoil from Sarah's visit had left me drained and disoriented, and for a moment, I couldn't remember why I felt so hollow inside. Then it all came rushing back. The cold demands, the ultimatums, the complete absence of any maternal warmth in my own living room. I dragged myself out of bed and shuffled to the kitchen, hoping that coffee and routine might help restore some sense of normalcy to my world. The house felt different somehow, as if Sarah's presence had contaminated it with her coldness. Even the morning light streaming through the windows seemed dimmer, less welcoming than it had just 24 hours ago. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I found myself staring at my phone, wondering if I should call Sarah, if I should try to reach out and bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Maybe in the light of day she'd realize how harsh she'd been. Maybe she'd call to apologize, to explain what was really going on in her life that had made her so desperate for immediate access to the trust fund. But the phone remained silent, and as the hours passed, I began to understand that Sarah had meant every word she'd said. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a stress-induced outburst. This was a calculated decision, a strategic move, in whatever game she was playing. I spent the morning in my study, trying to focus on work, trying to lose myself in the familiar routine of managing my clients' portfolios and reviewing market reports. But concentration eluded me. Every few minutes, I'd find myself staring at the empty chair across from my desk, remembering all the times Sarah had sat there as a child, chattering about school or asking for help with her homework. When had that curious, affectionate little girl become the cold stranger who'd sat in that same chair just hours ago? When had love been replaced by calculation, warmth by manipulation? I searched my memory for signs I might have missed, warnings I should have heeded, but all I could find were fragments, moments of selfishness that I'd dismissed as normal adolescent behavior, instances of entitlement that I'd attributed to the natural confidence of a privileged child. Around noon, I forced myself to eat lunch, though the food tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I was just clearing the dishes when I heard a car in the driveway. My heart leaped with hope. Maybe Sarah had come back. Maybe she'd realized how unfairly she'd treated me and wanted to make amends. I hurried to the front window and peered through the curtains, but it wasn't Sarah's BMW in the driveway. It was a delivery truck, and a uniformed driver was walking toward my front door carrying a large envelope. The documents inside were from Sarah's law firm, not her personal attorney, but the high-powered Manhattan firm where she worked. The letterhead was impressive, all gilt edges and embossed seals, designed to intimidate as much as inform. The content was even more unsettling. Sarah had retained the firm to represent her interests regarding the trust fund. They were formally requesting all documentation related to the trust's establishment, its current value, the identity and contact information of all trustees, and a detailed explanation of the procedures required to modify or dissolve the trust entirely. The letter was written in the kind of legal language designed to be both comprehensive and threatening. They weren't asking for this information. They were demanding it, with implicit consequences for any delays or refusals to comply. They'd given me 72 hours to provide everything they'd requested, after which they would pursue alternative remedies to protect their clients' interests. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making my hands shake more violently. This wasn't the action of a daughter who'd had a momentary disagreement with her mother. This was the opening move in what could only be described as a legal assault, a calculated attempt to strip away every protection I'd built into the trust structure. But what disturbed me most wasn't the legal maneuvering, it was the timeline. Sarah had visited me last night, delivered her ultimatum, and walked out of my house. She couldn't have contacted her law firm until this morning at the earliest. Yet these documents were comprehensive, detailed, clearly the product of extensive preparation and research, which meant she'd been planning this attack long before she'd set foot in my house. The conversation we'd had, the demands she'd made, the hurt and anger I'd witnessed, it had all been theater, a performance designed to provide legal cover for what she'd already decided to do. I called my own attorney, Margaret Walsh, who'd been handling my legal affairs for over a decade. Margaret was in court, her secretary informed me, but she'd return my call as soon as possible. I left a message explaining that I had an urgent matter regarding my daughter and the trust fund, then spent the rest of the afternoon pacing my house like a